Thank you very much. It's great to see you guys here today. So as Laurie said, and we were busy doing my sound check, so I wasn't paying quite as much attention as I should have. So you know that I'm with the university, and I'm here really today because I was one of the people at the New York negotiations from June across to July that culminated in the treaty, and here we have the actual official document, hot off the press from the UN website. And here I have a photo that I took on my mobile phone when the voting happened. So as I'll go on to explain, the Netherlands called a vote at the end of the 3.5 weeks of negotiations, and the treaty was voted in by a resounding 122 states for, 1 state against the Netherlands, and 1 abstention, which was Singapore. So it's not that clear. I was sort of, just kind of taking it quickly while it stayed up, but it might be something that people are interested in just sort of having a look at as it is. So I think, Laurie, I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, is that right? Yep. I can see from the faces, I'm speaking to the converted here, but that's kind of one of my big points, is that there's a tendency to suggest that this treaty has been 2 or 3 or 4 years in the making. There's a tendency to suggest that there was a new generation of protesters and campaigners. And I have all respect to them for the energy that they put into it, for the new generation of diplomats that picked it up, and for the work that everybody did to get us to this treaty. But I think it would be disrespectful and in fact wrong not to acknowledge the fact that the campaign for this treaty in fact started even before 1945, because even before the atomic bomb was exploded, there were, particularly the scientists involved, were already campaigning, if you like, saying we hadn't completely appreciated the enormity of what this would do, we urge you to step back from it, and so on and so forth. So one of the first messages is this isn't a new development. This treaty is actually a very important event, but a culmination, in my view, of more than 70 years hard work. And Laurie has been talking about how some of that played out here in Aotearoa over the years. And that's a really important story, I think, and something that we should treasure. Sort of as a more recent New Zealander, as you'll pick up from my accent, it's something that I'm very proud of as a Kiwi. So that's kind of my first point. This was a long campaign. My second point is that the treaty itself is a compromise. So this treaty is what we might call a simple ban treaty. It goes a little bit further than that. But in fact, if you look at across the last sort of 5 to 10 years, 5 years of negotiations, there was a number of ways this treaty could have gone. And there was many in the NGO community and among states who thought that we should work towards a gold standard treaty. And a gold standard treaty meaning that there would have been a fully fledged verification system to work out how exactly states would disarm, and so on and so forth, so that it would all have been locked into place. In fact, what we've gotten is a very slim version of that. It is a categorical ban on nuclear weapons. It goes a little bit further than that in providing for what will happen if a state that is a nuclear weapon state decides to join the treaty, and I'll talk about some of the technical details of that, but not too much, I promise. So the treaty itself is a compromise, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that, particularly Laurie talks to us about how we should have peace in our heart. Well, peace in your heart for anyone who lives with anybody else means compromise. So I don't say it's a compromise in a disparaging way. I say that this treaty, it isn't like this was the treaty. It wasn't clear, in fact, until probably March this year, that this was going to be the shape of the treaty. There was more ambitious, many other voices that thought we should be more ambitious, and that didn't come to pass, and we're never going to know. We don't have a control group. If we had held out for longer, would we have gotten a stronger treaty? Do we now have this slimmed down version, and it's going to be very difficult to build momentum? The message I would take from it is we don't know what would have happened if we'd held out. We might have held out for another 70 years and still not have a treaty. That's the essence of a compromise at the negotiating table. What I would say is we need to make it the best that we can make it, and there's a lot of really hard work to be done, and I'm actually going to be suggesting some of the things that we as individuals can do about making this treaty, really ensuring that its promise comes to pass, basically, in as best that we can do. So those are kind of two sort of preliminary points. It might be helpful, and I'm sure many of you, know quite a lot about this treaty, but it might be helpful for me to just give a couple of little bullet points for a few minutes. So I said it's a comprehensive ban. When you go to Article 1 of the treaty, it lists the things that states have promised or states will promise not to do, and it is things like use, possession, stockpiling, development, and so on of nuclear weapons. For countries like New Zealand, it would be fair to say it probably doesn't take us that much further than what our obligations already were as a matter of international law. But there are many other countries where it does take them very far. And that's because of our own nuclear-free legislation that Laurie has been talking about, and also because we're already a state party to the Rarotonga Treaty, so the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone, and we're already party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and on and on. If there was a nuclear agreement going, New Zealand is on it. So in fact, this treaty hasn't really changed what New Zealand's obligations are, but that of course is not the case for all states around the country. One of the big issues for debate in New York on the ban, the contours of the ban, one big issue was the question of threatened to use. So it doesn't just prohibit the use of nuclear weapons, it prohibits the threat of use of nuclear weapons. And that's a tricky thing, because the question is, does a threat to use, obviously a threat to use nuclear weapons, we've seen it between North Korea and the United States in recent weeks. Probably implicit, it would have to be said, from President Trump, but very explicit from North Korea. So that's clearly a threat to use. But one of the questions that was debated in New York is whether it is a threat to use nuclear weapons if you allow the stationing of nuclear weapons on your state, or if you are in a nuclear alliance. So let's take Australia, for example. If you're in a security alliance with a nuclear powered state, and under the arrangement between Australia and the United States, Australia has conceded and the United States has asserted that that security alliance means that if Australia is threatened, the United States will use nuclear weapons as a response to that threat, which becomes very volatile if you think about the statements that North Korea have made then in consequence against Australia. So it does all of that. Could Australia join this treaty with this threatened to use provision in it? So that was discussed a lot. It's in the treaty, there will be differing interpretations of it. Stationing of nuclear weapons is explicitly prohibited in this treaty, and that's a big advance from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of the late 1960s, where that's been a debate. So as you will know, there are American nuclear weapons in a number of European countries. So the Netherlands, hence their negative vote, Turkey, Spain, Germany. So those countries could not ratify this treaty without having the nuclear weapons removed from them. So I think that's an important step forward. There was also a lot of discussion, and this is the last point I'll make on the extent of the ban. There was also a lot of discussion in New York about the provision that bans assisting, encouraging, or inducing any state to engage with nuclear weapons. And the question is, again, if you're in a security alliance with somebody, or even if you, let's say New Zealand deployed troops to Afghanistan as part of the multilateral alliance, are you then assisting an another country if they hold a nuclear weapons arsenal. And we've had that debate about landmines, and we've had that debate in the cluster munitions, and here we have it again. In any event, the treaty simply says, do not assist, encourage and induce. There are different interpretations of how far that stretches. So that's the comprehensive ban, and that's the core, that's the heart of the treaty, really. Beyond that, what happens from here? Well, what happens from here is the treaty will open for signature, I think the 23rd or the 20th of September. That's when the General Assembly will be meeting. The treaty will open for signature from the 20th of September. The treaty needs 50 states to sign and ratify. So sign is a sort of a preliminary gesture of good faith, and ratify is, generally speaking, when it's gone through their parliamentary processes and they firmly commit to it. So when I teach this in treaty law with my international law students, I talk about signature of a treaty as getting engaged, and the ratification is you getting married, is the sort of like there's a preliminary good faith obligation and then a final binding commitment. It's going to need 50 states around the world to take on that final binding commitment, and then the treaty will, what's called, enter into force. Thank you. The treaty will enter into force. How long will that take us? It's anybody's guess. 122 states are in support of this treaty, so that's, we've got more than enough states who've put up their hand and said we're interested in being part of this. The question is how long it'll take. Most countries will need to ensure that their domestic legislation is sorted out before they take on that final promise. In New Zealand, you might think because we have our nuclear-free zone legislation that we're good to go. And then the lawyer in me sat down and read the legislation and compared the exact precise wording to the treaty, and I'm not so sure anymore. And because the treaty has stronger provisions than our legislation, and that's, I'm not criticising the legislation, I'm simply saying this legislation was drafted 30 years ago, and we've different discussions now about insist, encourage, induce. Does that mean investment? Things that we didn't even think about 30 years ago. So other countries around the world will need to do that. That's all going to take time. I think it would be astonishing if this treaty entered into force sooner than 2 years, but it might happen before that. It may well happen before that. But governments will not be in a position to advise their ministers to make that final promise unless they're certain that everything is okay in their domestic sphere. And that's because the treaty has a provision in it that requires its states parties. So it says each state party shall adopt the necessary measures to implement its obligations under this treaty, and it will take all appropriate legal, administrative and other measures, including the imposition of penal sanctions to prevent and suppress any activity prohibited to them. So it's just going to take them a while to get through it, and we shouldn't be reading and we shouldn't allow any discourse to be read into a delayed entry into force, that's states around the world having cold feet. It's that they need, if they're going to promise to honour this treaty, they need to make sure that they're able to do it and that their houses are in order, and that's all it would be. That being said, New Zealand has a proud history of, being pro-nuclear disarmament. It was a very active delegation in New York. It has been a very active delegation in the years leading up in this particular wave of activism. It has been. And as an Irish Kiwi, I have to say the sort of second best delegation was the Irish delegation. And they, again, led by another very strong woman, and they were amazing, and they did amazing work, and they brought the room together, and they were fantastic. Austria was another very strong delegation, did a lot of hard work, both in the years leading up to these negotiations and here. As we know, we have an election at the end of September. Austria does too. There will be other countries. It's not clear to me that New Zealand will be able to sign this treaty on the 20th of September. In fact, my guess right now is that New Zealand will not be able to sign it. And that's because we require Cabinet to approve a signature of an international treaty. And the Cabinet closes off on the 22nd of August. And what date is it today?
Today's the 19th.
Well, there you go, Monday. Monday they closed for business before the election. So we're not going to sign it. But I do think that it's really important for New Zealand to be an early signatory. So when it opens on the 20th for signature in New York, there'll be a grand ceremony and the ministers will come and they'll all take photographs and be all self-congratulatory, and that's all great, and we're going to miss out on that. That's a shame. We need to start talking about not, oh, New Zealand wasn't an original state party, so if the Australians want to poke at us or the United States want to poke at us, well, they're all gung-ho, but now see the treaty has opened and we haven't signed it. No, but we should be among the early signatures and the early ratifiers, so within the next few months. So it should become a priority, whoever is the next government after the election. And that's where it comes to us. In my point of view, anybody who cares about nuclear disarmament, for any emails to your MPs or the people standing in your electorate, any public meetings that you're at, it needs to be hands up the first question. What is your personal position on ratification of this nuclear weapons treaty? When will it happen? If you're forming the government, when will it happen? How far up on your list of priorities is it? And because there's going to be a lot of work to be done, my sense is that we still have the Green Labour are probably more pro this treaty. It seems to me that our Minister of Foreign Affairs made some troubling statements, and he was called out by the Greens in the House. He made some troubling statements about this treaty. For example, at one point he said, well, they're not really negotiations because none of the nuclear weapon states are there. Well, no, they are still negotiations. So there might be, he might be ill-informed or he might be antagonistic towards the treaty. But as people with the privilege of having a vote in a functioning democracy, I think that they, all sides need to understand that this is a priority and that New Zealanders take it seriously, and it mightn't be getting media airtime, but the politicians need to be looking at it. Let me see what else I would say. There was, I think one of the many very interesting things about this treaty is the emphasis that there has been on victim assistance, an acknowledgement of the harm done to communities that's of particular relevance in terms of our Pacific region, but also Indigenous Australians and in fact Indigenous Americans for all the tests that were done in the Nevada desert. And I think that this treaty has, is quite strong in some of its statements about acknowledging the human harm that nuclear weapons have caused us, even though they have only ever been used in anger, as they say, towards the end of the Second World War. So I think that that's important. It's also interesting that there's specific reference to Indigenous peoples, the impact on Indigenous people, and the gendered nature of nuclear weapons. So in terms of, it's the first time to my knowledge that in an international document we've an acknowledgement of the impact of radioactivity, particularly on the female reproductive cycle, and that leads us into an intergenerational problem where we have children and the next generation damaged both from exposure to testing and of course from the use itself. So I think that that's sort of quite an interesting, makes it a very 21st century document, for example. And that's another example of how far we've moved in 30 years, because you won't find discussion about that in our nuclear, in our 1987 legislation. It was 30 years ago. The discourse wasn't how we talked about it 30 years ago. So what else will I say? I just want to check the time. Let's talk about who's not in the treaty. So I've said to you 122 to 1. So the Netherlands, I want to speak in defense of the Netherlands, which doesn't make me popular among civil society, but here's the thing. The first thing, so the Netherlands was always against this treaty. It has nuclear weapons stationed on its territory. It is a member state of NATO, and they're in a security alliance, as you know, with the United States. So they didn't want these negotiations to go ahead, so there had been a vote in the United Nations at the end of 2016, and the Netherlands were one of, so 132 states voted to move forward to the negotiations. The Netherlands was among those states who voted against it. They turned up at the negotiations, not because they had a change of heart, but this is a shout out to civil society in the Netherlands, because there was such a campaign in Dutch society saying to their government, no, you will go to the negotiations and you will participate in the negotiations. And a petition was laid before Parliament, and Parliament said you need to go to the negotiations. But of course, still the state of the Netherlands, the official position was not going to change. So that's a shout out to Dutch civil society. Let's not confuse the government with the people. The second thing to say is that when he got there, and for most of the 3.5 weeks he sat alone on his delegation, so there was just, so for example, in New Zealand had a delegation of 4, sometimes 5. Mr. Dutchman, who often came with his orange tie, he sat alone. People were civil to him, of course. They're all diplomats moving in those same circles. He was polite, he was courteous, he took the floor, he played no games, he explained clearly what his position was. So when they were negotiating Article 1, he said, we will not be able to agree to any treaty that outright prohibits stationing of nuclear weapons. Now, while many in civil society strongly disapproved of them, but I was very glad to see that there wasn't any disrespectful behaviour that I have witnessed in some previous negotiations where, for example, people have seen fit to boo at delegations who are in the room expressing their point of view, which isn't actually helpful, right? But it's also not peaceful. So he played no games, he made clear statements of what his country's position was the whole time. And the final thing that he did was, the night before the last day of negotiations, he contacted the chairperson, the ambassador from Costa Rica, and said, we have instructions from Capital that we're to call for a vote. So many countries wanted this treaty to be adopted by what we call consensus. So we might not all agree, but we'd like to have a statement that we've all been able to say, yeah, we agree with that statement. And an option for a state that doesn't agree with the outcome would be to say, we're not going to block consensus, they say, we're going to step outside while you do your consensus. So we won't be party to it, but we're not going to stop you doing your consensus thing yourself. It was hoped that that would happen. He had the courtesy and the professionalism and the respect for the process and the respect for the other states that had a different point of view to the Netherlands to say 24 hours beforehand to the ambassador, we're going to call for a vote. We have to go for a vote. So everybody knew that they were going to lose 122, to 1. And that's exactly what happened. When it went and he pushed his button, and when you think about it, like, that actually requires, you need to be sort of quite staunch to do that. So while I completely disagree with the Dutch position, I do think it is quite important to sort of, at least they were, unlike the Americans and the British who stood outside the delegation, and Representative Haley made this speech, I'm standing here, she said, because this is the only space I have. I'm speaking to you as a mom, as a sister, as a daughter, as a friend, and I care about your safety, and that's why I oppose this treaty. And you can go on the internet and get her statement while she stood there. So in this appalling sort of double-mindedness, just appalling. The Dutch did not, so people go, oh, the Dutch were the only country in the world to vote against this treaty. No, they were the only country in the room that voted against this treaty. But if there was 124 states in the room, it means that there was, here we go, 80 states outside of the room that weren't participating, okay? So how about we don't pick on the Dutch so bad, okay? Australia wasn't there at all right? So in terms of the other nuclear weapon states, so one of the big arguments is that this treaty is pointless because the nuclear weapon states aren't going to join this treaty in the foreseeable future, maybe even in our lifetimes. So the nuclear weapon states are, of course, the 5 states that have been sanctioned by international treaty, as in, you know, we acknowledge that they have them. They're considered to lawfully have them among the international law community. So the United States, the Russian Federation, France, the UK, and China. And then in addition, you have North Korea, Israel, Pakistan, and India. Okay, so none of those 9 states are within a cooey of coming in. If we're going to lay bets, if we were going to open bets, I would say to you that the UK are going to be the first to break ranks and come in. And I think, you know, not that I'm an international relations expert, but I think that if you have a further fracturing with Scotland, if Scotland actually seceded, where are they going to put their weapons? Because most of their weapons, if not all of them, somebody in the audience might know better than me, are stationed in Scotland. Now, so can you imagine the good citizens of Birmingham going, yeah, no, that's fine, they can have their own country, bring the nuclear weapons, you can put them outside town, they're safe. No, they're not. So as a political matter, like I think if Jeremy Corbyn had won the election, we could well have seen the UK take a different position. And it'll be because they won't be able to put the weapons anywhere, so you might as well make a good news story out of a bad news story and say, you know what, we're going to be thought leaders. We're for nuclear disarmament, let's get rid of them. And here's the thing, they only have about 250 of them, which is pointless compared to the 7,500 that the United States and the Russian Federation have, right? There's kind of no point in having 250 nuclear weapons. You're much safer without any at all, right? So we could see cracks, and the treaty does allow for that cracking to happen, and there is a pathway in Article 4 for states to join this treaty, and basically they've put off all the hard decisions as they had to do and say, if you join, then there'll be meetings and negotiations, and then we'll figure out how to do it. But the more conceptual point is this: what value does this treaty have if the states with nuclear weapons actually are not going to be party to it? Well, the value that it has, I think, is this. Nowhere else in law do we say we shouldn't have a law unless we're certain it's going to be obeyed by everybody all the time. Right? We see that in drink driving is the classic example of it, right? It isn't that nobody drink drives anymore in this country, right? We would be foolish to think of it. It isn't that we have laws now, much harsher laws than we used to, about domestic violence. It isn't that nobody beats their wife anymore. That's just not true. But we don't say in response, oh, well, we shouldn't bother with them because they're just not going to obey it. There's no point. We don't. We know, so a lawyer would say, we know that law has a normative force. So we know it does somehow impact some behavior across time and become stronger and stronger, to the point where we self-enforce it. So now at dinner table, and again, if you go back 30 years, right? If we're on the theme of 30 years ago, 30 years ago, if you had somebody at your dinner table, how many of us really, when they said, oh yeah, I'll have another glass of wine, how many of us really would have said, aren't you driving? Really? Would we really 30 years ago? But today, we would actually say, oh, I thought you said you were driving. How about I've got some soft drinks, right? We've changed our behavior, right? That's law having a normative force. So I believe, and we see it, so that's in our own communities, right? It's something that we can all kind of really relate to. The Landmines Treaty, which as you will know, was agreed in 1997. The United States and China are still not party to it. Let me tell you what's happened with landmines since 1997. The United States goes to the meetings of the states' parties. It's allowed in to sit at the back as an observer state. It has pulled all of its landmines off active deployment. It has made progressively across many, many years, and most recently, I think last year, has said, we will now not, as our landmines become old and need to be taken out of active service, we're no longer replacing them. They've stopped investing in them. They've stopped there, and they've now said that they won't use them in any conflict except for the Korean Peninsula, because of course that's one of the big issues, and why South Korea is out of the Landmines Convention as well, because that demilitarized zone, there's an ironic phrase, is just infested with landmines, right? But they've said other than the Korean Peninsula, they will not use landmines. They're not a party to this treaty, right? They're not a party to this treaty, and yet we can see that the Landmines Treaty has influenced their behaviour. China, the same, has progressively said, yeah, we're not going to use them, or we're only going to use them here. Now, on one purist view, that's unacceptable. You know, we're not going to use them except on Koreans. Okay, that's unacceptable on one view. But on another view, it's progress compared to we considered it business as usual to use them. So from that point of view, I don't really see, of course I can't look in the future, I don't really see any reason why this treaty won't be the same, that it is part of a normative framework. It's not a magic bullet, that's probably a very bad metaphor to use. It's not the sort of secret recipe to an immediately more peaceful world. But if we start to see particularly the NATO states and countries like Australia and a security alliance kind of going, whoa, okay, we're demonizing these weapons, and you know what, it's always going to be very difficult to make a decision to use them in any event. Maybe we could actually start changing our posture slightly, and we don't need to make any big radical response, but the next thing, it'll be 30 years on and we will discover that they've stopped renewing or that they've moved more off high alert. I hope we don't have to wait so long for such modest gains. But I do think that this treaty is important, and it's also important in the same way, and I'll finish with this point, it's also important in the same way that for the states who have not been and who have never been nuclear possessor states and will not and do not support it, in the same way for those of us who, for example, do not agree with violence in our homes and in our communities, we need legislation on the books to make a statement of value about what the values that our community stand for, and say, we're going to criminalise this conduct because we do not approve of it as a moral issue. And so therefore, I think already this treaty is having an effect, an impact in us being able or have a way to say, this is who we are, and this is what we stand for. And that in itself could well give light to many other things across Australia, across Britain, maybe across the Netherlands. Germany is heading into another election. Things do change, and things will continue to change, and I think that this treaty will allow things to change for the better. So it is worthwhile as a legal tool, I think that this treaty is. But there's a lot of work to be done, so to repeat my kind of main message, if you're out there speaking to politicians, I think our very first step is saying to them, here in New Zealand for this election, is this a priority? Yes. What kind of a priority? What date do you anticipate that the treaty will go before Cabinet? Give me a date. Will it happen before Christmas recess? That's it, Laurie. Thank you. Have a nuclear weapon. There has been concerns in the international community that it's peaceful energy, so it's programs for peaceful energy, production of nuclear energy are being sort of siphoned off, and that in that way that they might start to develop a weapon. And of course they're next door to Israel, that's an acknowledged nuclear weapon state with 80, the best guess is that Israel has about 80 to 90 nuclear warheads. So there has been concern about Iran for a long time. The year before last now, actually, I think the Iran deal was 2015, even now, the years go by. So in the end, after this whole cat and mouse game between Iran and the international community, Security Council had imposed sanctions and so on and so forth. Europe particularly were very sort of pushing very hard against Iran. A deal was done where Iran undertook again that it was not doing any sort of shadowy business, accepted much more stringent international observers and international inspections, so harsher inspections than any other state in the world is open to in terms of inspection. So there was a massive compromise on the Iranian side. On the American and European Union side, the massive compromise that they made was they said, we're going to immediately reduce our sanctions on you, and then we're going to have progressively across, once the inspectors come back and say in 6 months, you know, we're confident so far, inspections stay in place, and progressively release the sanctions. The Iranian community in Iran, there was, you know, the people are really suffering under the sanctions, and so that was greeted really well. In the United States, because there's just, popular opinion in the United States was much more complex, okay? It wasn't greeted. In Europe, it was greeted with open arms as well. My point of view on it, it's very cleverly done because it's not a treaty, they talk about the Iran deal. And the reason why that's very important, that it's not a treaty. If it was a treaty, it would both have to have been ratified by the Iranian parliament and ratified by the United States Senate. And there was no way that you were going to get that level of agreement on. So it was like an executive deal done, that it was enough for the executive, so the presidents, to sign it. That does mean that Donald Trump can pull out of it anytime he wants. So it kind of has a shadow side to that as well. My opinion on the Iranian deal is that it is a brilliant example of peaceful resolution of a deal, where there is no military response to Iran. There's no, you know, all we can do is hope that they do not break out and develop a nuclear weapon. And I think that this deal, that isn't a treaty, is the best hope that we have of it. Positions are hardening now again, and you know, we're in a very bad situation on both sides in terms of more hardliners, both on the American side. My hope is that the European influence will calm everybody down. So I think that things are I'm more optimistic that Iran is non-nuclear weaponized than I have been for a number of years, and I'm hoping that it stays. On nuclear energy, I don't really work in that area at all. From a nuclear disarmament point of view, nuclear energy is important, is significant for two reasons. Number one, there's always a risk of breakout where you have that technology. But number two, that we can see that accidents or natural events like in Japan after the earthquake show us how dangerous nuclear substances are. So that actually is helpful in the nuclear weapons sphere. And what we in the nuclear disarmament sphere, because it goes, yeah, no, there is no such thing as safe radiation. I'm not sure what my position is about nuclear energy, to be perfectly frank. Like I can really see, like I think that we need to like turn off the lights and walk to Henderson from Titirangi before we start getting a bit pious about how we're going to service our energy needs. I think it's very easy to talk about servicing our energy needs, and we've generally done it when we've gotten in our car and driven to a meeting in a nice warm building with lots of lights on. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on the nuclear energy. But I hope that that's answered your question on Iran, or my thoughts on the Iran deal. Yeah.
Does Singapore have nuclear weapons stationed on it as well?
I meant to talk about Singapore. No, it doesn't. So Singapore is very interesting because its problem in the negotiation. So ASEAN were very, very active. So the Association of Southeast Asian States were very active in the negotiations, very for the treaty. Singapore appeared to be very for the treaty. That was their stated position in all of their statements. Initially, I had thought that Singapore had abstained. So to abstain is when you say, well, I'm not against this treaty, but I'm kind of not really for it either. And it was clear in the room that the treaty was going to go through anyway. I had thought that Singapore had abstained because of the transit. You can't accept transit. There's a very complicated discussion.
That's of nuclear capable ships.
Yeah, well, it might be nuclear capable, it might be nuclear powered, or it might be nuclear weapons. And there was some shocking, and I'm not very good at remembering figures, but there was, to me, some shocking information about how many nuclear weapons are transiting around the globe at any given time. It's sort of quite scary. Singapore is a massive port. So can they accept those ships in, and how does that relate to their obligations under maritime law if a ship is in trouble and needs to find port, or needs to come in and refuel or get more water or whatever it does. So it's hugely complicated. So Singapore's position during the negotiations was we can't have transit and so on and so forth. But then I've heard from diplomats that Singapore kind of didn't really realise what they were doing, and there was misinformation when they went back to capital the night before and said, we are going to vote, we need some instructions, and they kind of, the instructions weren't clear, so they thought, okay, I better go abstention, the treaty's going to go anyway. So I'm not sure where the real story lies. Possibly both of those things could be true, because they were concerned about transit and transshipment, they were concerned about that, and possibly then that got garbled to capital, that didn't give a clear instruction because of those different points of view, and so therefore they pushed the abstain button. Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been an issue at that stage anyway, would it?
No, there's no way Singapore, yeah, I mean, it was very, very clear. That morning of the vote, there was questions about Sweden and Switzerland as to whether they would vote against the treaty. And that was about stationing and NATO and so on. So there was, and then in the morning when they came in, you could see the other delegations kind of going, whatever, and then the whispering went through the room, no, they're going to vote for it. So it was a done, everybody expected it to be, like it would have been shocking if you'd had more than a handful of states voting against the treaty, yeah. Yeah.
I was watching YouTube with my grandson, who's 9, and he was looking at Biggest.
Yep.
And what he got onto was the submarine, the biggest submarine possible, can stay underwater, I think it's for 72 days, it's nuclear powered.
Yeah.
But it said that as long as, this is just for a child to listen to, as long as we have the weapons, there will be no war. It also said that one nuclear armament could destroy a whole continent. Would that be true?
Not all nuclear weapons are equal, so yes, there will be. So Hiroshima at the time was the biggest bomb, and Hiroshima now is pathetic compared to the size of some of the bombs that are in existence right now. It's unlikely, and there may be somebody else who can pop in with the technicalities of it for me, it's unlikely that they would take a whole continent, but there's no question that it will impact a whole continent, because the power of so there'll be the explosive power of the actual detonation, so the same as what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the same as what we see in the Pacific in terms of the immediate impact. But in fact then what you will have immediately is they will say, like if you had even 1 or 2 exchanges of kind of medium weapons, that you would have enough radioactivity released into the atmosphere that it will immediately cool the Earth's temperature by several degrees, and that will bring what they call a nuclear winter, what they talked about in the 1980s. And one of the things now is a lot of the scientists are now and again that's another difference between 30 years ago and today, they're now able to do their modelling to a much more sophisticated level to work out exactly what would happen. But if you think about it, if there was an exchange, let's say North Korea, one of the first things that's going to happen is you're going to have a mass movement of people. People are going to get in anything that they can do to get out of the radioactive zone. So it's going to have, not only would it affect New Zealand in terms of the environment, but in terms of the human catastrophe of people within that hot zone in terms of their movement. It would be catastrophic. And that might not be rational. So there's a danger of sounding very patronising when I say that, but it might be you'd actually be safer to stay where you are, But actually, would we move, like if there was a nuclear detonation in Sydney, would I still be happy to be standing here? Nah, I'd be Samoa, thanks, my first flight to Samoa. We want to move out of the zone. So yes, there would be massive repercussions. In terms of your first question, which is your grandson making the point that if there's nuclear weapons, it means we won't have a nuclear war. That's, of course, the theory. That's deterrence theory, right? So that it keeps us all safe because it's so appalling that we know. There's hundreds of books written on that, but here's what I would just say to debunk that myth. It assumes that everybody is a rational actor. It assumes that people in control of these weapons, so first of all we assume that states have them, right, not ISIS. And then we assume that states are led by rational actors. I think we only need to turn on our radios to understand that that's not true. And it might actually be one of the blessings of the Trump administration for us to stop with this notion that we're in, you know, that the Western states are civilized and stable and we've checks and balances. Like, we really don't. Right? So deterrence works on the basis that everybody is rational. We know that that's not true. And mistakes happen.
And also, it's obvious that having nuclear weapons doesn't stop conventional warfare. The world's continuously at war all around us all the time, and sort of uncontrollable human problems of refugees and everything.
It's exactly right. So it doesn't stop conflict. It doesn't stop conflict. And there's some very good studies done and some very interesting books published in the last few years about the decisions not to use nuclear weapons in the Vietnam conflict and in the Korean conflict in the 1950s. So why? So the United States lost both of those wars. But they were the only side that were nuclear powered, that had nuclear weapons. So if nuclear weapons are so amazing, why didn't they just use them? Right? It didn't stop the wars, it didn't end the wars, and it hasn't stopped or ended any other wars. And in fact, arguably, look at Iraq and look at the flow-on effects from the Iraq War of 2003. And that was about, in large part, nuclear weapons, nuclear, chemical and biological, about suspicions about them. And that war hasn't finished.
What were they called? Weapons?
Weapons of mass destruction.
And they didn't find any.
No.
No, that's right.
That was hideous. That was absolutely hideous.
Yeah, and this is why I consider the Iran deal to be a very positive story, because even if we can't say right now we're certain that Iran will never develop ever again in the future, we're certain this deal will hold, but what was the alternative with Iraq? Right? So we're in a better situation at the moment.
Okay.
Oh. Just quickly say that I think that I am Iranian, and when the Chernobyl happened in Russia, there was major concern about food and crops because the clouds above and the rain, and we couldn't, in Iran there was a shortage of food because of that. So if there is a nuclear attack of some sort, it would be actually it would impact on our food chain and everything.
No.
The only thing I want to say about Iran, which is quite sad, is the fact that the sanctions were not lifted. The inspectors were allowed to come in. They inspected everything, and 2 years down the road, $1. It's all the same. So unfortunately, last week the Parliament voted that the sanctions can maybe they should continue with enriching, because it gave them leverage and power, just like what it does to North Korea right now. I mean, deterrence, as you say, works. So where do we go with that? Where do Iranians go when they were all so happy? Well, fine, come in, check everything you want, lift the sanctions. 2 years later, nothing's happened. They still pay 3,000 toman for $1. Which means, it's just it's hard for people.
So so my understanding is that the EU sanctions have been lifted, and my understanding was that the UN sanctions were lifted, and then so there was 3 different set of sanctions. Now I'm not aware of, and I've just made a note here of what the situation is on the ground, but I had understood that the sanctions, and again there we had this hideous expression, targeted sanctions from the 1980s and the 1990s, but I had understood that in terms of foodstuffs particularly, that sanctions had been lifted. But I could be wrong about, obviously, you're in a position to know better than I, but it'll be very important for that to get addressed. And this is one of the things that I find extremely frustrating about our media. These are the things that we should be talking about and calling on the European states to exercise their influence to ensure that the deal is being met by the EU and the United States on that side, because that's the way, like this deal is the safest option that we all have, right? But instead of which we constantly pay attention to the North Korean situation when we already know that they probably have 8 to 10 nuclear weapons. We already know that. We already know that they're not able to yet reach, even for all his bluster, reach. But what happens is we indulge ourselves in this constant narrative of crisis and not pay attention to actually, well, we've got a deal that it could be a full success story, is very promising. How about we have proper discussion and proper attention being paid to that instead of this constant hysteria, frankly. Yeah, so I agree with you, but I've made a note of that, to look that up. Thank you.